Emily Crane had been on Ward B for 11 days, and she had already learned one thing about Nurse Marsh: the woman never raised her voice. She did not raise it when the orderlies backed up the linen cart into the medication station and knocked a full tray to the floor. She did not raise it when Dr. Mercer stood at the nurse's station before rounds and talked over her assessment of the man in room 6, his hand cutting the air between them like she hadn't spoken at all. She did not raise it when Mercer looked up from the chart and said, with the particular patience of a man who has repeated himself many times, "I'll handle the protocols, Nurse Marsh. You handled the night routine." Marsh had looked at him for one flat second. Then she said, "Yes, doctor," and turned back to her station. Emily had watched that from the supply alcove, her arms full of gauze rolls, and she had felt the kind of second-hand embarrassment that sits in your chest for an hour. But Marsh had not looked embarrassed. Marsh had looked exactly the same as she always looked, a woman doing the next thing that needed doing. She was lean, early 30s, with dark hair pulled straight back, and she moved through the ward the way water moves in a river, always in the same direction, nothing wasted, no hesitation at the turns. She had a small scar along the left side of her jaw that Emily had noticed on the second day and then stopped noticing. She kept a worn paracord bracelet on her right wrist, olive drab and frayed at the knot, and Emily had never once seen her take it off. That was December. The ward smelled of floor wax and recycled heat. The radio call came in at 11:47. Emily heard it from the medication station, a VA security line, the voice clipped and flat: "Reserve convoy, Route 9, bus collision, multiple trauma, ETA 18 minutes, they were flagging 4 critical." Mercer was still in the building, 2 floors up, finishing a consult. He appeared at the ward door 4 minutes later, still pulling his white coat straight, and took a position at the nurse's station with the look of a man who intended to manage the situation from there. Marsh had already moved. She had the trauma bay open, both exam lights up, the crash cart unlocked and rolled to position, 2-4 lines staged, the suction unit checked and live. She had assigned the 2 floor nurses by the time Mercer crossed the threshold, 1 word each, and she had put herself at the head of the bay without asking anyone's permission. "Who authorized the bay configuration?" Mercer said. "I did," Marsh said. She was pulling on her second glove. She did not look up. "For critical inbound. You want lead on the first chest?" "I'll take all 4, he said. "You won't," she said. "Not at the same time. Tell me which one you want." He looked at her for a moment, the way people look at an appliance that has said something unexpected. Then the ambulance bay doors opened and the first gurney came through, and there was no more time for any of that. Emily pressed herself against the supply alcove wall and watched. The first patient was a young reserve corporal, chest wound, GCS dropping. Mercer moved to him, reached for the laryngoscope, and then stopped. Not dramatically, not with a shout. He just stopped, and his hand slowed, and his face changed in the way that faces change when a man encounters a problem that exceeds what he was prepared for. Marsh was at his elbow before the pause had lasted 2 full seconds. She did not ask. She did not explain. She put one hand on the patient's chin and said, "Crick kit," and someone placed it in her hand, and her fingers moved with a certainty so absolute that Emily could not process it in real time. She was watching a procedure she had only seen demonstrated on a plastic mannequin, and the woman performing it was doing it the way a carpenter drives a nail, unhurried, exact, each step landing in place before the next one began. "Airway open," she said. "Bag him." She had already turned to the second gurney. The second patient had a femoral bleed, pressure dressing soaked through, tourniquet applied wrong in the field, too low, and barely cinched. Marsh looked at it for half a second, said tourniquet, high and tight, reset it herself with 2 practiced motions, and called the pressure reading without waiting for the monitor. She was right. Emily understood, standing in the alcove with gauze rolls going warm in her arms, that she was watching something she did not have a framework for. Not speed, she had seen fast nurses. Not confidence, she had seen confident doctors. This was something else, a kind of organized calm that did not come from training alone, did not come from years in a hospital, but from somewhere older and harder and further away than any of that. The third patient. The fourth. She moved between them the way a river moves between stones, around and through, never pausing, never fighting the current, each action setting up the next one the way one domino sets the next. She spoke in two-word commands that the floor nurses seemed to understand before she had finished saying them, and Emily had the strange sense that those commands were not hospital language, that they belonged to some other vocabulary entirely. Mercer had stabilized his patient. To his credit, he had settled and worked, and the chest was holding. He looked up once and caught Marsh moving between the third and fourth gurneys, and something crossed his face that Emily could not name. At 12:22, all four patients were stable. The ward was quiet the way a room goes quiet after a near thing, not peaceful, but held. The monitors beeped on. The floor nurses moved carefully, like people in the aftermath of something they hadn't expected to survive. Mercer pulled off his gloves at the sink. He did not say anything to Marsh. He did not look at her. Marsh was writing in the first chart. Her handwriting was small and even. The paracord bracelet was dark with something she had not stopped to wipe off. Emily was still in the alcove. She had not moved in 35 minutes and only realized it when her feet began to ache. She heard him before she saw him. The sound came from the doorway that connected Ward B to the rehabilitation stairwell, a slow footfall, the soft drag of a man still working on a hip that had been rebuilt twice. Staff Sergeant Carl Edens had been on the 4th floor for 6 weeks, and the nurses said he was the quietest patient in the building. Former 3rd Special Forces Group. The kind of quiet that came with a hard history and no interest in discussing it. He was standing in the doorway in a hospital gown and grip socks, one hand on the frame, and he was looking at Marsh. She had not heard him come in. She was still writing. He said, "Iron Bell." One word. He said it the way you say the name of something you had not expected to see again in this life. Marsh's pen stopped moving. She did not turn around right away. She set the pen on the chart. She straightened one slow degree at a time, and then she turned, and for the first time that Emily had ever seen, the expression on Rena Marsh's face was something other than controlled. Edens was already standing straighter, the hip forgotten. His right hand had come up to his chest. "What group?" Marsh said. Her voice was the same as always. Quiet. Even. But the word had weight behind it now that Emily could feel from across the room. "Third," he said. She nodded once. Something moved behind her eyes. "Caver," she said. "Caver," he said. Emily did not know what Caver was. She found out later. It was a patrol base in a country the official records referred to only by grid reference, and 6 years ago it had collapsed under indirect fire for 11 hours with a 9-man Special Forces element inside it. The Army's classified file listed one name under life-saving actions, individual, SFC-RL, Marsh, 18D qualified combat medic, whose interventions under direct fire had kept 6 of those 9 men alive long enough for the medevac to reach them, and who had kept working after taking a shrapnel fragment to the left side of her jaw, and whose Distinguished Service Cross recommendation had been sealed and filed in a drawer that nobody opened for 6 years. Edens looked at the ward. He looked at the 4 gurneys, the crash cart, the 2 nurses still charting, Mercer at the sink. He looked at Marsh. "These your patients," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. He turned his head to the door and said, to nobody visible in the corridor, "I need the charge station. 3rd floor." Emily did not understand what that meant until the footsteps started coming. There were 5 of them, all patients from the rehabilitation floors, in various stages of ambulation, one with a cane, one with a single crutch, one trailing and 4 stand. They filed into the doorway and spread themselves across the threshold, looking at Marsh the way Edens was looking at her, like men who had been waiting a long time for something they had almost stopped expecting. Edens said, she brought 6 men home from Caver. She did it with a hole in her jaw and a field kit. I was one of them. Mercer had turned from the sink. He was holding his crumpled gloves. "Sir," said one of the men in the doorway, and Emily heard it land wrong before she understood why. He wasn't talking to Mercer. He was talking to Marsh. Call her ma'am, she thought. You'd say ma'am. But it was sir, the old shorthand, the one used in places where rank superseded everything else. At ease, Marsh said. She said it softly, without thinking, the way you say something you have said 1,000 times. The man with the 4 stand said, "We heard it from up there. We heard you working." She looked at them all. 5 men she had never seen before, plus Carl Edens, 6 of them in a threshold and grip socks and hospital gowns, and the thing that had been sealed and filed and put away in that drawer for 6 years was standing in the room now, and it was not going anywhere. The hospital commander arrived at 12:51. Major Helena had been called by the night supervisor, who had been called by the security station, who had been called by nobody, but news moves in hospitals the way it moves in small towns, fast and with its own gravity. She came in through the main ward door and stopped when she saw the group at the rehabilitation threshold, and then she looked at Marsh, and she said, "Sergeant Marsh." Not Nurse Marsh. Marsh stood. Major. Ware had a tablet in her hand. She had pulled the file herself, from the VA Systems Liaison Portal to the Army Personnel Records Archive, and it had taken her 14 minutes and 3 calls to get the classified portion unlocked. She held it at her side. She did not need to read from it, she had already read it, and her face had been settled into a specific expression ever since. She said, "I owe you an orientation I should have given you when you came on staff." She paused. "I didn't know." The file was sealed. "I'm reading it now, and I want you to know I've read it." Marsh said nothing. 6 patients stabilized at Caver Fire Base under direct fire. Field airway on Sergeant First Class done, tourniquet and hemorrhage control on Specialists Okafor and Reyes, all 3 presenting critical. You ran them all simultaneously. You sustained a penetrating jaw injury somewhere in hour 2 and did not report it until the medevac had cleared the wire. Ware stopped. The element commander's recommendation says, quote, "No other living medic could have held that bay." Unquote. She looked up. Distinguished Service Cross, sealed. "I'm going to see about that." The ward was very quiet. Mercer had not moved from the sink. His gloves were still in his hand. Emily was in the alcove with gauze rolls she had completely forgotten about, and she was trying very hard to stay still, because she understood that this was not a moment you moved through, it was a moment you held your position and witnessed, so that later you could tell it right. Edens spoke first. He said, simply, the way soldiers speak when there is nothing more precise to say, "She knows what she's doing." And from the doorway, the others, 5 men in grip socks, men who had spent weeks relearning how to walk, straightened. All at once. Shoulders back. Chins level. Not in uniform. It didn't matter. Marsh looked at them. She looked at all of them. She did not say thank you. She picked up the pen from the chart. She said, "I have 4 patients to finish charting." And she bent her head, and she wrote. Emily Crane stood in the alcove for another long minute, the gauze rolls warm in her arms, the monitor beeps steady and slow. She thought about the paracord bracelet, olive drab and frayed at the knot, on the wrist of a woman who had been working this ward for 2 years while being told, in ways large and small, to handle the night routine. She thought about the hole in the jaw, and the 6 men, and the drawer the file had been sitting in. She thought about all those December nights, all those double shifts, all that unhurried competence applied to men who had come home broken from places Marsh had been to herself, and come home from just the same way. Not loudly. Not with anyone watching. The monitors beeped on. The ward settled. Emily stepped out of the alcove, set the gauze rolls on the station cart where they belonged, and went to find out what she could do next. She would spend 22 years in emergency medicine. She would teach the cricothyrotomy technique to 400 students across 9 residency programs. She always started the same way. She would say, "I learned the most important thing about this work from a woman who never raised her voice."